There's often discussion and often dispute about what training is required for workers entering a confined space. Hi, it's Laurie from Total Management and Training, where we have been providing assistance to organisations for many years in health, safety training and business management. We have been involved for a number of years in the determination of confined spaces, preparation of confined space entry procedures and also the provision of confined space entry training. Workers and their supervisors must have the skills and knowledge to understand the hazards associated with working in confined spaces, the contents of the confined space entry permit, the control measures implemented for their protection and any emergency procedures. Training should be provided to workers who enter a confined space. They are the individuals who will actually go in and conduct the work, and they must be given training that is relevant to them carrying out that activity. They must be provided with training in undertaking hazard identification or risk assessment in relation to confined spaces. This may be particularly applicable to a supervisor or a manager who is managing the process of confined space entry permits. Even though they may never enter a confined space, they must understand the hazards that are associated with it and the controls that must be put in place. Workers must be trained in how to implement the risk control measures. For example, how to use gas detectors, how do you carry out gas monitoring. Workers who issue the permits must be provided training in the understanding of the content of those permits. A person who is going to act as a standby person must be provided with training in the confined space entry, the communications and also the rescue procedures. It may also be necessary to monitor the conditions in the confined space, and workers must be provided with training in the use of that monitoring equipment. An area that is often overlooked is people who purchase confined spaces and purchase equipment for use in confined spaces. They often do not carry out the work, but they are the people who sign off on the actual equipment and materials that are going to be used. So it's important they're provided with some understanding of the issues that are relevant to a confined space. People who design or lay out the work area, which includes a confined space, in the very early stages must also be provided. So we make sure, for example, that confined space entry points are adequate for getting people in and maybe in some instances getting a stretcher in. Training should relate to the type of confined spaces, and that will generally cover things like the nature of the hazards associated with the confined space, the need for and the use of the risk control measures, the selection, use and fit of PPE, the contents of any relevant confined space entry permit and emergency procedures. It's really important that the training in confined space is relevant to the role. For example, I was recently involved with a sand mining operation where the sand actually passes through a number of processes removing rocks. The workers in that particular area had been sent away to a confined space entry course, and when the workers came back we found that they had been trained how to enter sewers. There was no reference in how to enter a space where the person could be engulfed with rocks and how that should be managed. So the training they actually received was not relevant to the work that is going to be carried out. There is accredited training that is required for confined spaces, and this may be relevant to the work that is being performed in your workplace. However, the legislation does not specifically state that accredited training is required. It is perfectly in line for an organisation to do non-accredited training. And in the previous example where I was talking about entry into a rock silo, the entry should have been in and around this particular entry point. It was the only confined space entry on site, and it could have been delivered non-accredited. The legislation requires that workers undergo retraining or refresher training appropriate to the work and the workplace. There is no defined timeframes involved. The organisation themselves must establish the frequency of refresher or retraining required. Records of training must be maintained. This also should provide you with a reminder to carry out the refresher or retraining. If you want to see what must be considered in the management of entry into confined spaces, please consider looking at our other videos, completion of a confined space entry permit and determination of emergency procedures for a confined space. Thank you for watching.